requirements and the needs to stay healthy, happy, and whole. So the government's response to the virus, which we have been dealing with since January, is one that first and foremost places an emphasis on lives, preserving lives. That remains so unquestioned, and the commitment remains the same as it was in the beginning. All our actions put saving lives first. In so doing, as we said in the beginning, actions to preserve our lives would have serious negative effects on our livelihoods. We talked and worked a lot with the economy, and I think by and large the population understood and is on board with respect to how we have managed the economic aspects of things. We saw our initial lockdown of the country virtually closing down our economy. Except for essential services, all our productive activities were virtually shut down except for a few areas. And today we are dealing with a separate aspect of lives and livelihood. One of the main things we did to preserve our existence in the face of a pandemic is to have closed our borders. We have separated the people who are resident and present in Trinidad and Tobago from all persons who are on the outside. We did it in two phases. Firstly, we said non-nationals are prohibited from entry. And then during that period, nationals, wherever they are, whoever they were, had the opportunity to come home. And then later on, we closed the border even to nationals, because to effect and to get the outcome that we wanted, we had to shut the border down to all persons, because the virus is no respecter of persons, national or non-national. So we closed the border. And as of today, I can re-emphasize that our border is closed. However, we did say then that even as we closed the border, we would allow some exemptions to allow persons to come back in on a managed basis. And the caveat with that is that that movement of people back in would be in the context of what we are doing at home. Meaning, we've set up our parallel health system with the capacity to handle a certain amount of sick people, and we always have to preserve the hospital capacity in the event that we lose control of the situation. And that can start with one person infecting our community. Because of how we have handled our affairs so far in this country, we have not reported, thank God, any community spread. However, throughout this pandemic, we have to preserve the hospital capacity in the event that the country requires hospital capacity. If you look outside, you will see where there are difficulties in countries and in states, in cities and towns, where the hospital capacity has been overcome, and that is where a crisis replaces a problem. So we have to preserve the hospital capacity. We spoke about different stages of exposure. Persons who have been tested positive, persons who have been exposed to persons who have been tested positive, persons who have to be quarantined, regardless of what it is, from where they've come, because we are not exposing persons who have not been exposed to persons who have been exposed. So these are different categories of people, and their accommodation have been different. So let me just go through what we have done and how we have been doing it with respect to this exemption that we have been operating. Now, all persons outside who want to come home, under normal circumstances, they would have come in and gone out with no questions asked, no problem. These are not normal circumstances. The closure of the border in a pandemic, which is a fact in Trinidad and Tobago, has created difficulties for persons on the outside of Trinidad and Tobago who are nationals of Trinidad and Tobago. I did tell you from this podium that there are many tens of thousands of persons outside who can, if they choose to, present themselves at our border and claim to be nationals of Trinidad and Tobago with our passport, and they are entitled to come home under normal circumstances. That's about 330,000 people. Over 200,000 of those people, I think the figure is 275,000 of those people, are in the United States, living there, earning their livelihood there. But there was a category of people which now seems to be approximating to about, I would say, 8 to 10,000 people who at the closure of the border would have been on the wrong side of the fence. They would have been outside. And the reason how we got to that figure is that when we closed the border, we said, make an application to the Ministry of National Security to be considered for an exemption. And I assume that persons who were in transit or who were normally domiciled in Trinidad and Tobago, who were outside and wanted to come back home, in that period of the many weeks and months that we've been doing this, they would have applied to national security largely, except in emergency situations. Others would come onto the list. It appears now that with the numbers that we have serviced so far, and those who are on the applications list, plus or minus 1 or 2,000, it appears as though it's about 10,000 people. These are the people who come under the question of exemption. And let me tell you what has happened. As of the 11th of July, the Ministry of National Security has granted 4,515 exemptions. So we are granting these exemptions knowing that not every person who applies and is anxious to come home is able to come home at this time, this week, in some cases this month. Nationals have been granted these exemptions and have so far been repatriated from Guyana, Venezuela, Suriname, Barbados, Cuba, St. Martin, Jamaica, from cruise ships, and especially brought back home our children from Jamaica and Barbados who are at the campuses there. Now, if you look at these territories, you'll see two things. One, they are close to us. Two, they are among the territories with low infection levels. So in terms of ease of making an arrangement to bring them home, it was easier to do. And because the countries in which they're coming from, the reported risks are low, we took that risk of bringing them from those areas early in the repatriation game. So that would have governed how the exemptions would have been granted. The government has continued also to work with the energy sector and the oil and gas sector to permit entries to workers to keep the industry running uninterruptedly. You may recall that when we shut down the country's economic activity and closed the borders, we did say the energy sector was so important to us in the context of livelihood that we would allow them to continue their normal operations and facilitate it as far as we are able to. So persons working on rigs, which are in itself a kind of isolation, and because of the nature of that industry offshore, we allowed a flow of persons to and from these rigs managed by the Ministry of Health and the Ministry of National Security. The companies that were benefiting from that level of exemption were also providing private jet services for their staff in and out, and they were providing paid accommodation in state authorized quarantine for such staff. So that was a separate arrangement, and that worked fine. We brought in our workers from Mexico and also workers who are on our offshore here in the oil industry. As a matter of fact, during this time, when this was happening, the mischief-making engines were disrupting the public psyche by talking about private jets coming in and bringing in friends and associates of the government and all of that. And it took us from this podium to tell you it is not so. Those private trips are well authorized because it is part of the decision we made to keep the energy sector. And not even the pilots are disembarking from those planes. They bring staff in, the staff goes in a helicopter and out to the rig. And in that way we manage our risk. Of course, we had some of our children, some students in India and travelers in India. We've granted exemptions to people in India, to people in the Middle East, and of course, to people in Europe. But then, unlike people in the region, Grenada, Barbados, and Suriname, those people outside of our region pose an extra difficulty to those persons. Because understand, the government is not off on a mission to search around the world for our nationals to bring them home. We've left that responsibility of getting yourself home to the persons who are asking for those exemptions. So persons in India, the Middle East, and Europe, they get to a point where they can get transport into the Caribbean region. You must remember, there are either no or very few commercial scheduled flights available to our citizens in those parts of the world. So even getting a flight out of India to London and to Barbados is not an easy thing nowadays, right? So, but we granted the exemptions at the appropriate time when it was their turn to be granted, and of course they're on their way and others have arrived from there. So this is how it has been going. On top of that, at the Ministry of Health, certain categories of people were treated with a little more dispatched. Persons who were confirmed to be in medical situations and had medical emergencies. Elderly persons who were trapped outside. Persons with young, small children, they were given certain considerations. So these were some of the considerations. But there's one aspect that needs to be looked at from the global perspective. The government, in dealing with this exemption matter and treating with our citizens outside, has to look at it as a global exercise, a faceless, nameless exercise. We know we have persons out there, and some of those persons are going to apply to come in, and we deal with it in that way. However, there's another aspect of looking at it at the personal level. There are people who are out there in hardship, of course. We understand that, we empathize with that. But then the policy cannot be who gets on television first and who cries on television. Because then if that is how it is, then you will not be able to have an effective system where these said people can enter. Because persons, if you say, okay, persons who are on medical or have a medical issue, then every applicant will simply say, I'm sick. On the other hand, it is only when you get down to the personal level and then you see the personal pain and the personal hardship, then you begin to think that maybe we should have the decisions made on emotion and let everybody come in. Or let people come from heavily infected areas in large numbers. And then what does that do to the basic policy up front of lives and livelihood? I want to let the people of Trinidad and Tobago know that the only reason why we are in this position of relative comfort at this point in time is because we have resolutely stuck with the scientific fact. We have most of our contacts and most of our requests coming to us from the United States. The closest point to us from the United States is Florida. Yesterday, and in the last week to 10 days, every single day, Florida has been reporting an increased number of infections with COVID. It would be irresponsible of us here in Trinidad and Tobago to have followed the policies we have followed effectively so far and then not very carefully manage the flow of people from those areas into Trinidad and Tobago. I want to remind the population, it does not take a boatload of people to infect this country. All you want is one person who falls outside of the managed protocol. And that person is what my colleague in the Ministry of Health call a super spreader. We only want one of those. And if we end up like an American city or a European city, there have been cities in Europe and America where persons virtually gave up because their systems had been overwhelmed. We saw in Korea, one person in a bar caused the country to have to revert to where it came from because the infection levels had been so high with one person operating in a bar. What we have done so far is, as far as we were able to, was to keep our population at home away from persons who may infect us if certain levels of risks were overexposed to us. That's what we've done. And the government has made certain infrastructural arrangements available. We have a number of state quarantine facilities which were known to you before. I'll tell you again. We have the UWI-DB campus. We have the home of football in Couva. We have the Takarigga Racket Center, Balandra, a center up there. I think we still have the place in Sangre Grande. And we have Napa for the staff. Supported by the state at no cost to persons who are brought in and who within our protocols are required to stay in there until they are deemed to be clear of the potential of the virus. They've tested negative after the quarantine period, and the CMO department makes a decision that you're free to go among your population and among your family. That's how we've been doing it. So when we talk about bringing people in, the numbers that we bring in is in the context of how much we can handle in the system that we have in this country. The health system, the hospital beds and hospital system to remain ready and available. The quarantine system to handle people safely. So far, we've brought back thousands of people safely. And we will continue so to do. Nobody has been abandoned, nobody is being punished, and there's no deliberate policy to trample on anybody's rights. What we're doing is trying to protect everybody's life, especially those persons within the border of Trinidad and Tobago. In the case of our children in the universities, what we did and was able to do and was doable, when we couldn't bring them in at the time when they wanted to come home, and we couldn't accommodate them within our quarantine system, we sent them some sustenance. Because that was easy to do. We knew who they were. They were under the control of an administration in Jamaica and Barbados, so it was easy and doable for us to send a check or some money so that they could, those who were saying they couldn't buy food and those who were saying they couldn't pay rent and so on, that they were given that sustenance until we could bring them in. In the meantime, operating with Caribbean Airlines, the Ministry of National Security and the leadership at Caribbean Airlines working together, managing the exemptions and flights. We had our students in Cuba. There's no connecting flight between Trinidad and Tobago and Cuba. But we did make that arrangement once the exemptions were granted. When it was time to bring them in, we worked with Caribbean Airlines and we got a flight arranged with people on exemption, or identified students and others, and we brought them in from Cuba, and we've done so safely. This government, this country, has been handling this matter in a way that many others have not done. And it is somewhat a little disappointing to see now that emotion is beginning to be the yardstick by which we judge how we respond to the virus. Let me just say to the population of Trinidad and Tobago, the virus is still a threat. The virus is still a danger, especially if you are to import people from an area which might very well be the most infected area in the world. We have to be extra careful. At the moment, the ministry has also gone further because we are trying to bring more people in. We've got another hotel on list, the Hotel Regency at Piarco, looking for more rooms. But there's another side to the entry of people into the country while the border is closed. Some persons are in a position to, having got an exemption, to pay for state-supervised quarantine. Such exemptions are only granted after an exemption has been granted to come in. If we simply say, who can pay for a room in a hotel are those who will come in. Because remember, whether you're on state quarantine or you're in your privately paid for room, if you do get sick during the quarantine period, you have to go to the hospital. So the number of persons awaiting possible hospitalization have to be measured against the number of rooms you have in the hospitals waiting for them in the event that they do get sick or show symptoms. So there's a balance between those things. And we simply could not say, who has the money to hire a private jet, then okay, you can come in. Those persons were also in the scheme of things of persons being imported into the country from areas of infection, of high infection. However, in order to increase somewhat the amount of persons who are coming in, the rate at which they're coming in, without increasing the government's outlay, when persons are granted exemption in the exempting process, such persons may be asked whether they are willing to or prepared to pay for state quarantine, state supervised exemption. And if they agree, then such persons, there are 2 or 3 hotels that have been authorized to receive persons. I think one is the Cascadia, the other is the Chancellor, and there's another one. Well, we did have some people at the Cape Up for a short stay. Good. So that is all part of the managed arrangement. So those are the arrangements in Trinidad and Tobago. The Ministry of National Security, in granting exemptions to the initial numbers of nationals from Canada, the UK and Europe and the Middle East, have asked these persons whether they would wish to pay for the cost of state supervised quarantine or whether they require state quarantine. Depending on the responses, the number of exemptions may increase to allow us to bring certain persons under those conditions, right? And of course, since you're operating an exemption process, you have to be dealing with it on a case-by-case basis. Someone comes to the Ministry of National Security and says, I have an emergency, a serious medical emergency. I need to be hospitalized and have surgery in Florida in a week or in 2 days. Can I have an exemption? Can I go out? Yes, you may go. You get an exemption for that if it's granted, and it should be granted. But then you understand, one of 2 things can happen there. When you go out, you become a person outside. That's one way of looking at it. Having gone out, you are now out there with everybody else. And further, you are at the end of the line to come back in. Or you can take the position that since you have gone out from being domiciled here for that particular purpose of a specific surgery, at the end of it, if you then say, I'm ready to come back home and I'm ready to pay my way home to come back into quarantine home, then it may or may not be granted. That decision has to be made by the Ministry of National Security. So this is why we say on a case-by-case basis. In my own case, my daughter is in New York and wanted to come home. Her sister was having a baby. She wanted to come home. These are family matters. She has not been allowed to come in. Not even encouraged to apply, because I know how that would have been playing here in this country. But I tell you, I lived through the trauma of the New York situation with a daughter in New York, at ground zero in New York. I have very close family members right now in Texas and in California who are literally sitting in their homes, afraid to come out in the street because they don't know what they're going to meet there. So I, as head of this government, I understand personally what people are feeling in this matter. And while we empathize, while we sympathize, we do the best that we can to ensure that we minimize the pain and suffering of those persons who found themselves outside of the border at the time when we closed it. And that the border will have to remain closed. When we started out here on the same platform, we talked about a 3-month window. And given the science that we understood at the time and the guidance we were getting, we thought that at the end of 3 months, what exists now in the Caribbean might have existed in the wider region. And by region, I mean here from Alaska down to Central America, South America. It has not played out that way. In fact, it has played out quite differently in the area where we have the most people on the outside wanting to come home. So the closure of the border still remains a decision to be stayed with by the government as long as the outside is what it is. The opening of the border is going to be influenced not by the number of weeks it has been closed, but by the nature of the exposure outside, which has the potential to bring the virus to us. I want the people of Trinidad and Tobago to put yourself in the shoes of the other people who are making the news and ask yourself, if that is what you want for Trinidad and Tobago, you might want to solve a small problem by creating a calamity. I have heard one caller on a radio program last week agitatedly and very dismissively saying that we don't have the virus here. We are not reporting any community spread here. And missing the point that the reason why you could make that statement is because we have done and we are doing what we are doing now. Not that you don't have it and therefore open the door and bring it. But that is not his decision. That is a decision for the government of Trinidad and Tobago. And we make that decision in defense of 1.3 million people, many of whom have family members outside and would love to get them in. There's a very small minority of people who see opportunity in this to create manima in this country. And all I ask the population is to identify them individually and watch them carefully, because you would find that their statements and their advice and their posturing do not have the best interests of the people of Trinidad and Tobago at heart. They are looking for opportunity because they only prosper when this country fails. That is their position. Our position is that we can all survive in this together. We're all paying a price. We're all paying a price. But at the end of the day, if we manage it well, we'll come out of it well. We are now seeing a conflating of a decision made about the CPL and this matter of exemptions and repatriation. I want to say to all the persons outside, their family members inside, and to the wider national population, the two things are not mutually exclusive. In this policy of lives and livelihood, the CPL aspect of it is livelihood. That does not impact negatively on our management of the life and death situation. The state owns 3 hotels. In the closure of the economy, those 3 hotels, the Hyatt, Magdalena in Tobago, and the Hilton, there are approximately 1,000 workers among those 3 hotels. What did the government say to the private sector? The government said to the private sector, please understand our circumstance. As far as you are able to, as far as you are humanly able to, do not send your workers home. Do not cut your payrolls if you don't have to. Make an extra step, take an extra cost. And many companies in the private sector did that. Those who didn't do it or couldn't do it and ended up cutting people off the payroll, taxpayers stepped in and gave a grant to thousands of persons who had, in one fell swoop, in attempting to evade the virus, they lost their livelihoods. The government could not have made that request to the private sector, and the government, as owner of these hotels and the employer of 1,000 people, do the opposite. So the government had to do exactly what private sector companies did, which is to pay to keep the staff in jobs while the hotel was virtually closed. To keep the Hyatt open and keep almost 400 persons on the payroll in jobs cost taxpayers $8 million a month. To keep the Hilton open and approximately 350 or to go with approximately 400 workers, these are direct workers, cost taxpayers $2.6 million a month. And the Magdalena, with approximately 200 workers involved, $1.3 million a month. That's over $12 million a month that the state paid to keep workers on the job within the policy of holding people in jobs by the employer while we wait out the threat of the virus. So that being the case, we now have the country in a state that is sufficiently healthy, sufficiently safe, low enough risk that we could host an international tournament, the T20 tournament. We are the only country in the world at this time that can do that. And the reason is, those who've made the assessment have rated us #1 in the world as the country that best handled this threat and this challenge. And the results are there to show, and therefore we can host the CPL when they approached us to. It has nothing to do with bringing in CPL players and leaving out citizens outside of Trinidad and Tobago. Because whether the CPL had come to us or not, the 200 rooms at the Hilton would not have been used for COVID quarantine. As a matter of livelihood, we could not, because if we were using the government hotels in Tobago, the Magdalena, and in Trinidad, the Hilton and the Hyatt, if we had used them as required for us quarantine, what was going to happen if some infected people ended up inside there? You remember in Grenada, where one person in Grenada was reported to have tested positive for COVID, and hotel workers came under almost physical threats in Grenada? You all forgot that? People did not want to travel in taxis with hotel workers in Grenada because the hotel they were working in had positive COVID patients, they said. You all forgot that? So the government kept those hotels as part of our livelihood away from quarantine arrangements, so that when the day comes for us to use them, we would be able to have that infrastructure to rekindle our livelihood. So, to host the tournament here and to keep with the protocols as required by the CMO, the Hilton rooms were deemed to be available to 250 paying people. And let me answer the question. No, the government will not be paying for CPL personnel. CPL personnel will be hoteled in the hotel at their expense. And that will reduce on the taxpayer's shoulder the burden of 2.6 million a month doing nothing. But during August into September, if the CPL is here, the hotel will be doing normal business of providing hospitality to people for a fee. Some people have a problem with that. And some of them, you know them by name, rank, and political number. Would you believe that after the cabinet agreed to the terms and conditions under which the CPL would be allowed, the Minister of Sport spelled it out, I myself spelled it out, the CMO spoke about the involvement of the Ministry of Health. Would you believe that some person here in Trinidad and Tobago appears to have impersonated the CMO's office and have sent to the CPL contrary information, causing this whole matter to now be questioned as to whether or not the CPL would be held in Trinidad and Tobago? Because information purporting to come from the CPO has been fed by certain persons to the CPL subsequent to the government's position, which now caused the Minister of Sport to be talking to the CPL to confirm what the government's position was vis-a-vis information provided purportedly from the office of the CPO. There are people in this country, CMO, there are people in this country who are prepared to undermine the national effort so that the country will fail, so that they may succeed in their ambitions and their agenda. I maintain that I have confidence in the vast majority of people in this country as being decent, right-thinking citizens who understand reason and understand that in all things that we do, we are all in this together. And that is why today we will continue to bring as many people home as quickly as we can while protecting the gains that we have made in securing the lives and in engineering the livelihood of people in Trinidad and Tobago. That is what the government will do. That is the commitment of the government of Trinidad and Tobago. And you can rest assured that we will keep that commitment. Any questions?
Prime Minister Drew Brown, TV6 News. The point you made just now about persons impersonating the CMO's office and providing what you said was just false information to the CPL. Is there any investigation to determine who has done this?
Where we have all I can say to you now is that the information transmitted to the CPL purporting to come from the CMO has been confirmed not to have come from the CMO. That's all I can tell you at this point in time. But the information was sufficiently important for the CPL to respond to the government about the new terms that we have offered, which are, in fact, not correct. And, of course, it can be confirmed that subsequent to the position that we made public last Thursday, there has been no change in the government's position.
And in terms of, and you did speak about the savings in terms of the hotels, the state paying, so that the CPL, but in terms of overall revenue, did you give a figure before?
No, that can come later on. What figure I can give you now is that with no business at the Hilton, you're paying $2.6 million a month to keep the staff on the payroll, because you have to have staff the day somebody comes in. If you do have guests, then that 2.6 for no revenue would be reduced, and reduced considerably, or even eliminated.
You have because you did say earlier, given what's happening internationally, especially in the United States and so on, Florida and whatnot, the 3-month window that is being extended. Do you have any sort of other deadline that you may think might be possible for opening the borders?
As of now, I wouldn't want to speculate, because if I begin to speculate, you would be the first one to come and tell me that you had said that you will do it on so and so day, and I'm not going to put myself in that situation. What I would say is, on assessment by the government and the chief medical officer as our advisor, the borders will remain closed as long as an open border poses a threat to the people of Trinidad and Tobago. How much longer, I do not know, but because when you look outside, open the border, there are pressures on Caribbean countries right now. The last heads of government meeting I attended, one of the items that we had on the agenda was a major American line that services the Caribbean were saying to us in the Caribbean, well, we are going to try to get some flights going, and if you want to get into the business for the winter season, you have to open to us now. We understood what that meant. We understood that in the boardroom of that airline, they would love to come fly into the Caribbean. We understood that they would love to bring people to us in the Caribbean. And we also understood that if they bring people to the Caribbean and they infect us, they leave us behind with the infected people. We know that. So Caribbean heads of government in CARICOM had to take a decision as to when we open our border and what risk we pose to our people in those decisions. So everybody looking out for him or herself. But the governments and this government in Trinidad and Tobago, we have to make decisions based on what is in the best interest of the people of Trinidad and Tobago. And the border opening or the border closure is to be seen in that context. As soon as we are able to, we will do what has to be done, which is to get back to a normal situation. In the interim, the Ministry of National Security and Caribbean Airlines would work together on the exemptions that are granted and the seats that are available, and go to the areas that can fly in and bring our people home in a managed way. I can tell you now, this week there's a batch to come back in from Grenada, again, another batch coming in from Grenada, and there's a flight to Toronto to bring some people in from that far away, because exemptions have been granted to enough people there to where CAL goes up and makes a flight. There's no scheduled airline service in most parts of the world. So in using our resources, we can't just say, all right, anybody who can pay to come home, get a flight and come home. Because then suppose a foreign aircraft, foreign airline, picks up 500 people and brings them here. What's our position? So we have to manage it. We're managing numbers. And if there are extraordinary situations, like the woman who made the vid blog that caused the headline in the papers today, if there was a way to reach out individually to that person, then we'll find it. But you know, the same pressures now to reach out to that woman. If I instruct the Minister of Finance now to send some money to her so she can pay for that room or to buy food, then every other person has a claim on that and say, look, me too. And it's preferential treatment, and it's unequal treatment, and so on. So at the level of the government, we did that with our children in the universities, because that was slightly different. But John Public, if you do that, then you open yourself up to all kinds of possibilities of negative responses, because the government is required to look at the picture of shapes and not faces of individuals.
Julian is from Newsday. You mentioned about 4,500 exemptions being granted. Do we have figures of how many actually have come into the country?
Having told you about the 4,500 exemptions, I can simply say the majority have already come in. There are not. There are some people outside with exemptions who are making their way home. And it's, in some instances, like those coming in from India and from the Middle East, it takes a circuitous journey. Even they themselves can't tell us when they're going to arrive because of moving from one place to the other. In India, moving from one state to the other is not easy. In some cases, it's forbidden. Right? So our people out there are going through these difficulties, and we understand it. When the exemption is granted, they were also told, advise us of your approximate date of arrival. Approximate because we are also being told, many people would be told you can get a flight, and then maybe the night before, the day before, the flight is cancelled for all kinds of reasons. Air transportation now is a lottery. So we can't be as firm in giving you a number as to when this person is going to be here or how many are going to come in on that day. We're managing an amorphous situation.
And I noticed you were mentioning the countries where they're coming in from, but you didn't mention the U.S. Have we brought back persons from the U.S.?
We have had people coming from the U.S. I mean, I'm sure you would have heard that Ambassador Beckles and MP Paragat came. They came from the U.S. And there are other people who came from the U.S. I simply mentioned that fact of life is that in the Americas, not just the United States, in the Americas now, the virus is at an all-time high, even higher than it was in China. So we started out responding in the way we did since January to a virus that was in China, coming to us from China. Right next to us now are countries with much, much higher levels of infection. So there's no case to be made that we drop our guard because we've been in this for so long. Now is the most dangerous period to drop your guard. We did the right thing when the virus was in China. When the virus was raging in Italy, we did the right thing. The only thing that we hope to God doesn't come to us to sober us up are the number of coffins that those people had to deal with. There were countries where the army had to come in to help local authorities to handle coffins. That is what the virus holds for those who do not experience the success that we have experienced. And it's not by accident. Our success has been at great cost to the people of Trinidad and Tobago, much of it not fully paid yet.
And you were mentioning the majority who want to return are from the U.S.
Yes, and the reason being that the majority of our citizens who are outside or who visit, most people who leave this country to go away, they end up in the United States somewhere. Or lesser numbers to Canada, or to the UK, or to Europe. We have the 330,000 people that I mentioned, they are all from all those destinations, but the majority are in the United States. Not that they all are wanting to come home, because some of them live there and can't leave. But because the pool is so large there, it is reasonable to assume that the pool of people wanting to come home would come from that area.
I was asking that, is a person from the US, we know that is the highest rates of infection, highest death rate. Is it that someone from the US is less likely to be granted exemption as opposed to somebody from Rowley or something else?
No. We are dealing with the condition of our citizens, but bearing in mind where they're coming from. If, as I said earlier on, one of the conditions and the exemptions were granted in the beginning was those who were coming from close to us. You remember the 2 weeks of the Barbados group. That was the first group, one of the first groups. I think that was the second group that came in. They were in Barbados, right next door, just 45 minutes away. But we allowed them to quarantine out there to come in here after 14 days. That went relatively successfully, but it also carried with it some resistance, some of it quite unfortunate. But the end result was, out of Barbados came that group. Then we had Grenada. Then we had Suriname, Venezuela. But while these people were waiting their turn to come in the managed arrangement, it wasn't uncommon, and still isn't uncommon, for persons to interpret it in ways that are unfortunate.
Crystal Wilson, DDD Limited. My question is either for the CMO or the Minister of Health, and it's with respect to the Ministry of Education today issuing the dates for the academic year 2020-2021. Perhaps that is confirmation that school does in fact begin on September 1st. What we have not seen yet though, guidelines for teachers and students with regard to preventing COVID-19, and if you don't have those details, how soon can we expect it?
Right, so in terms of the guidelines for students, I had given to the Ministry of Education, we had a meeting with the Permanent Secretary as well as the Chief Education Officer over close to a month ago, where we provided the WHO UNICEF guidelines, which is, our guideline is based on the WHO UNICEF guideline as well as the CDC guideline. So last week I held another meeting with the PS and the CEO. We gave a timeline of this Wednesday to provide them with our final guideline, which is a Ministry of Health document tailored upon those two documents. So we will provide it to the Ministry of Education, our PS will provide it to their PS. They will use that guideline to flesh out the final details with their PTA, etc. And they would publish, the Ministry of Education will then publish a guideline from their PS saying exactly what they want to do when school reopens in September.
An additional question, there are a number of high-risk students within the student population. Is specific consideration being given to those students as well?
Yeah, so there is, we deal with it by age stratification, which is based on a UNICEF document, as well as high-risk students, which is more along the CDC lines, but we're pulling both of them together, and there would be how we deal with high-risk individuals as well.
But there's one other aspect of that, which other countries, some other countries have dealt with and are dealing with now. And that is once we get to that stage where, as you've mentioned, we are planning and we've committed to a September 1st restart of our school system. The contact between the youngsters and the home becomes an area of risk which we do not now have. There were some countries which were in the condition that we are in now, approximately, did reopen their schools and had problems and had to adjust, right, by going back. There are some countries that only this morning, there are a number of countries around the world who are now thinking about making decisions as to reopening their schools. So the reopening of schools is now a new phase of the challenge that governments have around the world. Here in Trinidad and Tobago, we, a little while back, mentioned September, all things being reasonably well done and our numbers remaining the way they have been going, we are working with a September 1st. But God forbid, if something happens that causes the numbers to go awry and we find ourselves in a different situation, then of course we will have to make the adjustment to suit. But as of now, we are anticipating and working towards and confirming our intention to have our children back out to school fully with the subsets that you mentioned, because there will be those kinds of nuances of the special children who have special needs and so on.
Does this involve a situation of masks being provided to the teachers and students by the ministry, or how does that work?
So again, our advice is based on a guideline, and we do not recommend at this point for the students, at least, to be wearing masks or face shields during normal hours. Teachers possibly, to have a recommendation based on the level of interaction that they're having. There's different categories of teachers. PE teachers, for instance, may be different from your regular form teacher. So we are working out those details, and education will put the final document together.
Hi, Mr. Good afternoon. I'm from Paul Chan from CNC3 News. I'd just like to return to the CPL note. I'd just like to return to the CPL note, right? Revenue aside, does the state have a comprehensive response plan in the event any of these players contract COVID-19 in Trinidad and Tobago?
The same thing that applies to a citizen of Trinidad and Tobago would apply to any human being who is within our border and is in fact confirmed to be carrying the virus.
I have one more question. So there are concerns that the state-funded assistance being provided to some of these, the grants being provided to some of these families who are adversely affected by COVID-19 are being given to P&M officers and not the office of the MPs. Can you respond to that, please?
Well, I'm not sure you mix up a couple of things there. No grants have been provided to any office in the country.
My apologies.
And hampers, and I don't know, I saw that coming from the UNC campaign, but I will treat that for what it is. I'm an MP for a P&M constituency, if you want to call it that. I'm the MP for Diego Martin West. My involvement with hampers is half of my salary to a supermarket to provide hampers for my constituents. Outside of that, I know we've received a number of hampers, and the Ministry of Social Development and Family Services have provided a small number of hampers to all MPs. All 41. That is my understanding. So if the UNC MPs did not give those hampers to their constituents, then that is unfortunate. I think the number was 150 or something like that. And the reason why we had done that is because we know that there were people who were going to the MP offices and who had immediate and urgent needs. And there were other groups of people who were being managed by the churches. And that's why we gave the ecclesiastical bodies, all religions, got a pool of money, small as it might be, to help them to provide food support. And the Ministry of Family Services were providing those boxes of vegetables, the chicken, for that period when we were in the teeth of the whole thing. Everybody was on board in trying to get food to people who needed, because we wanted to make sure that no one was left behind and that there was nobody in this country hungry because somebody didn't pay attention to them. We've gone past that stage more or less now. There are less people in that situation. People have gone back to work and are now earning and can buy their food. Many people relied on these. So this thing about mixing up MP office with improper conduct, I know nothing about that.
Prime Minister, I don't know if you may be able to give a direct response to this so you can find out. Any requests for exemptions, did they include any requests from persons who had said they want to return to Trinidad to be able to vote in the general election on August 10th?
I don't know of that, but you may want to put that question to the Ministry of National Security. I don't know the list of applicants, but I have heard of no such situation of any person applying to come to vote. Because I mentioned early on, and I'm going to say it again, the management of the border in response to this virus is not an election thing. It is a protection of the lives of the people of Trinidad and Tobago.
I'm just wondering, is there a process by which, let's say someone lives in New York or wherever, other parts of the world, and there's an embassy or high commission where they could possibly, is that allowed? Is that possible?
Possible do it.
In terms of voting, like if a person is outside of the Trinidad.
There's no provision under the laws of Trinidad and Tobago for persons outside of Trinidad and Tobago to vote. There is a provision that if you have to be out of the country and you are a qualified voter in Trinidad and Tobago, that you can vote before you go in the arrangements as made for you in those circumstances by the EBC. That is not something that is managed by the government.
I have some non-COVID questions.
I'm here.
You're here?
I'm at work, you know.
That's good to know. All right. Well, we're speaking about CAL and flights. We know the situation with Leah. Any consideration of possibly taking over Leah or taking over Leah's routes or anything like that?
If I knew that was the question you were going to ask, I might have tried to evade it. No. Trinidad and Tobago does not have a major interest in Liat. I should tell you, there was a time when Trinidad and Tobago was a major shareholder in Liat. And over time, the government of Trinidad and Tobago took the decision to get out of the LIAT operations. We ended up with about 6% of the shares as a residual. And what we have done, and we did tell you this early on, we have allowed the government of Barbados to use those 6% by proxy. So the government of Barbados is responsible for speaking for Trinidad and Tobago with respect to that 6% of the shares. So we are not involved at all in the LIAT business. And as of now, we have no plans to get involved in the LIAT arrangement. LIAT is owned by other CARICOM territories and with the blessings of Trinidad and Tobago. LIAT being an airline, CAL being an airline, CAL having some overlap with LIAT services, we are all in the same market, and the government of Trinidad and Tobago would leave that for Caribbean Airlines to protect the interests of the company and the people of Trinidad and Tobago while serving the region.
And my next question, I don't know if you call it the hotspot or the committee that had been set up to look into the areas where we had the protests and so forth. Just wondering if we get some more information on that. If they have a time frame to report or anything like that?
I met with them once, and they're off out there doing what they've been asked to do, and they will come back sometime at the end of the month or before. They're required to come back before the completion of the budget exercise, the budget preparations, before the budget is prepared to go to Parliament, so that we could include in the budgetary allocations any limited resources that may be available to treat with any recommendations that they may make that we want to act upon immediately, because the whole idea is to come up with an action plan, and we've left them to do that. So it's a little too early to expect them to come back to us with that, but they are required to come back initially with some phase one of something like that, where we can put something in the coming budget.
Okay. And the committee itself, is this a voluntary committee, or are they being paid a stipend?
Yes, to admit that, to accept the invitation to serve on the committee, that was volunteering, but because of what they're required to do and what, how much of the time will take up and so on, we're going to subsequently make an arrangement to provide them with some reasonable stipend.
Non-COVID questions, Prime Minister. Any update in terms of the supply of natural gas in Point Lisas Industrial Estate and the Dragon gas deal with Venezuela?
Well, the Dragon arrangement has been at a standstill for quite a while. We have signed, everything is in place between Venezuela and Trinidad and Tobago a long time ago. We cleared the way for the companies to operate. We got a term sheet. That meaning that the terms and conditions under which all that has been in place, but because of the United States sanctions on Venezuela, the advance of that has been not just slowed but virtually stopped. But everything is in place. That we did manage to get that far. When you reach a term sheet, you have virtually everything in place, and the operations could have followed. But the international conditions have changed. And with respect to Point Lisas, the Point Lisas is experiencing a bit of fallout from the international market. Our gas supply has remained relatively steady. We were up to about 3.6 BCF a day, but we down. The last figure I saw for the last reporting month was just under 3.2, 3.1 at 3.1. But what has happened is that one of the major users of gas in Point Lisas is the methanol business. But because of the effect of the COVID on the world travel market, both in the air and on the roads, as you would expect, the demand for fuel to fuel aircraft and road use, that demand has been considerably reduced. So some of the methanol producers have had to cut back on their production, firstly because the market had become so soft, and secondly we got to the point where there were no buyers. So that resulted in a cutback in the production at Point Lisas. So we are just, we are at the mercy of the international market, and that's where Point Lisas is. With respect to contracts and so on, we have made considerable progress. With the contracts, we got adjustments in the gas pricing when the international market started to fall apart. I've heard it said that it was our gas price that made us uneconomic. That is just tomfoolery. What has happened is that the market has changed considerably subsequent to the coming of the contracts, and the upstream have been adjusting to meet the conditions of the downstreamers. And it got to the point now where even if you have the gas to give them, the international offtake markets have put backward pressure onto Point Lisas. The LNG business is still going on at virtually high levels, but the LNG price has dropped, not only again because of the competition from the newcomers like the United States, but because the users of LNG have reduced, because you would know that the Chinese market, which was the main driver of the international community, that market subsequent to COVID has contracted considerably. So when we see contraction in the Chinese market and projections for any further decline in the Chinese market, that's very, very bad news for us, because it means that the demand for LNG worldwide would be such that there's an oversupply continuing, and that pushes the price down. On the other hand, we have price issues and volume issues in Trinidad and Tobago. So we are going through a particularly difficult period, but we trust that this is something that is an experience that we just have to stay the course, make sensible decisions, and hope at the end of it to come out with our lives in our hand. You know, last night, I have a small saving because I've been working for a long time. As you know, I've been working since I was never employed one day in my life. I can boast about that. And I've been saving, and last night I saw a savings account. I haven't even told my wife, but I looked at it, and this was my best savings account. And I looked at the statement last night, and it had declined. One had declined by 40%, another one by 39%. Now, I'm not getting any younger, so I don't have the opportunity to go and start to save all over again. I have to just hold the fort and hope that the markets turn around, and I hope to see over time that these mutual funds will begin to have a greater value, because the asset base in the international market where these local mutual funds are, those assets have fallen in value because of the condition of the market, but it bounces right back into the palm of your hand. So I saw mine last night. So if you ask me how much I was worth in January, and I told you, on those accounts, I'm 40% down now, having not done a thing except to be a victim of the international condition of the world.
So one of the things anyone at the head table can answer. The issue of bars, beaches, we've seen...
He goes to bars.
We've seen some bar owners...
That's what it's here. It's your money that I'm going to say you. Go by now, Bingy, and find out what's going on there. He's a regular visitor to Nabingia.
Correct. It's called Vital Corner in St. Joseph.
We've seen some bar owners complaining that the entire sector is being punished for the actions of a few. We've seen people return to the beaches, the rivers, and so on. Any assessment since the lifting of those restrictions and this government's take on this?
Okay, so both the CMO, myself, and Minister Young have been discussing this. Let me tell you what I have noticed. I was going down to a function 3 o'clock yesterday in past Woodbrook. Passing by one of the bars at the western end of Aria Peter Avenue at 3 o'clock in the afternoon, I was appalled to see throngs of young people in their 20s and 30s in such close quarters in this outlet, enjoying their tapas. It was scary. Joel, it was scary that people, And I don't only hold the bar owners to account for this. When I spoke about this issue weeks ago, I made a plea to both bar owners and patrons. Both bar owners and patrons to exercise caution and to be responsible. So what I saw at the western end of Area Peter Avenue yesterday tells me that some people are still not getting the message. However, driving back along Area Peter Avenue in the afternoon, all the gyros people, the food outlets, are adhering brilliantly. So we have a particular problem where alcohol is being consumed in a social setting. Because when you do that, your inhibitions drop. Reasoning goes out the window. And if you look globally, Joel, this is not a Trinidad thing. Many of the countries that have to re-lock down, the reason is because places of social interaction where alcohol is a main driver of that social lubricant, those entities become the local epicenters for news spread, and then the entire local community of that county, that town, that city is adversely affected. So this is not about punishing bars. It's about asking both bar owners and patrons to consume your alcohol responsibly. And that's what we ask for.
You see, there's a difficulty here where we call on people and identify that the required response is a personal response. While I understand what the bar spokespersons are saying, that look, we sell to these people, when they go out on the street and congregate, it's not really our responsibility. But within our establishment and on the edges of it where we do serve people, we can manage that. But they have to understand that the business that they are engaged in is a business that is calling people to violate the protocols. There's no other business doing that. The cake shop is not doing that. When people come out to bars, the very reason they come there is to hobnob with some friend. And of course, as the minister says, as you drink alcohol, you become less responsible. That's a fact. Alcohol has an effect on you. And that might be the reason why maybe everybody forgets to wear a mask. I got a call a few nights ago from someone, a very public-spirited citizen, who told me about a particular bar, that they were passing this bar. It was after the hour of closure, 8 o'clock. Inside the bar was ram-cram jam. Outside the bar was full of people. The music was playing, and they were just having a wonderful time. Now, considering what we have been doing for the last few months at great expense, great inconvenience, this group of people is putting all of us at risk. So, until the police tells me that they are in a position to make a redoubling of the effort to individually prosecute people who are doing that, the best that we can operationally do is to hold it where we have it now for the moment. Because if we are able to be convinced that the police can go out there, and when a bar becomes like that, it is closed. And I think there are violations of law there as well. When the Commissioner of Police tells me that his men and women can do that across the country, then we can make an adjustment, and I hope that that will be very soon. But we have to keep being responsible at the individual level, and apparently people who come out to have a good time are not necessarily required to be responsible. That's some people's view. So you come out, we said if you're going out, have a mask on. I see people in crowds around bars with no mask. And then if you are out, you stay away from people. You're required to have physical distancing. This activity is one where it is the opposite that you are trying to do. So it's a difficult situation, but don't forget what the objective is. The objective is not to give the virus the opportunity to jump from one person to another. If you stop that ability, then the virus in your population will lose its ability to replicate. And I think we as a people The government's approach was to rely on your responsibility. And so far we've done well. Not all of us have cooperated, but so far as a nation we've done well, but we are exposed to even small infractions.
Joe, let me just say one more thing on those bars. We need to understand that as a society, as an ecosystem, we all depend on each other. If one part does badly, it affects the entire system. If one part does well, the people who frequent bars in their 20s, 30s, and 40s, they have children. They want their children to go back to school in September 1, right? Could you imagine if by going to a bar, they contract the virus, they take it home, start to infect their school-age children, and then jeopardize the opening of school? The point we are trying to make is that we are in this together. The activities cannot be isolated and say, okay, bars, you do what you want. It doesn't affect the rest of society. And that's why I point out, food establishments are doing well, construction doing well, manufacturers doing well. The only part of society that doesn't want to accept their share of responsibility are the bar owners and their patrons. We want schools to open, but the bar patrons are the people who have children in schools, people in their 20s, 30s, and 40s. Let us keep our eyes on the prize of September 1, school, and don't jeopardize that.
I think this is a good time for us to get our daily report.
Yes.
So our daily report for Monday the 13th July 2020, the total number of tests done within the public sector, UE and the Caribbean Public Health Agency, stand at 5,809. The number of unique patient tests, 4,358. Total number of repeated tests thus far, 1,451. Community tests within the public sector, 2,077. Community tests within the private sector, 1,507. Total number of positives remain at 133, with the all last 17 cases have been imported cases with the persons that we have allowed through the borders on a phased basis. The total number of discharges are now at 124. The deaths remain at 8, and the total number of persons in the hospital stand only at 1 as of yesterday. So within the parallel health care system, to date, we have 79 individuals quarantined across 4 facilities. The UE St. Augustine Day Bay Penal Campus, we have 25 individuals. At the Chancellor Hotel, there are 12 individuals. At the Napa, where we have our healthcare workers, we have 21 persons. And at the Cascadia Hotel, we have 21. Thank you, Prime Minister.
Well, thank you very much for that report, and I think that's a good point on which we can end the day. Thank you all very much for coming, and hope that we get some accurate information out. Good to see you again.